Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's grand gamble, a massive invasion designed to bring the Soviet Union to its knees and secure Nazi Germany's dominance over Europe. But this audacious plan, which Hitler believed to be foolproof, was met with resistance that not only derailed his ambitions, but ultimately led to one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. In the Mastermind strategy that completely wrecked Hitler's invasion plans, we explore the brilliant tactics, relentless resilience, and masterful deceptions that turned the tide against the Third Reich and ensured that Hitler's vision of conquest ended in disaster. Adolf Hitler's vision for the conquest of Europe was vast, meticulously planned, and devastating in its execution. By 1941, much of Western Europe had fallen under the iron grip of the Third Reich, and Hitler turned his ambitions eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military campaign in history, designed to crush the Soviet state and secure vital resources for the German war machine. But as unstoppable as the Wehrmacht seemed, the Allies devised a series of strategies that completely wrecked Hitler's invasion plans, turning his greatest gamble into one of the most catastrophic defeats in history. The Nazi war strategy was founded on the concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, swift, decisive, and overwhelming. This tactic had proved extraordinarily successful in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would crumble just as easily. He predicted that the campaign would last no more than a few months, with Moscow captured before winter. What he underestimated, however, was the resilience of the Soviet people, the vastness of the Soviet Union, and the mastermind strategy that his opponents would employ to outwit him. One of the first critical mistakes made by Hitler was the assumption that the Soviet Union was a fragile and incompetent state. While Stalin's purges had indeed weakened the Red Army's leadership, the Soviets were far from helpless. Foreseeing the likelihood of a German invasion, Stalin had begun moving key industries east of the Ural Mountains, out of reach of the Luftwaffe and German ground forces. This strategic relocation ensured that Soviet factories could continue to produce tanks, planes, and munitions, even as the front lines shifted dramatically. The Soviets also employed a scorched earth policy as they retreated from the advancing German forces. Entire towns, farms, and railways were destroyed to deny the Wehrmacht the resources they desperately needed to sustain their advance. This forced the Germans to rely on their own stretched supply lines, which became increasingly vulnerable to Soviet attacks, and the sheer logistical nightmare of transporting goods across thousands of miles. Hitler's logistical challenges were further compounded by the Soviet winter, a factor he disastrously underestimated. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped for the brutal cold, with soldiers lacking proper winter clothing and vehicles ill-prepared for the freezing conditions. As temperatures plunged, German machinery broke down, and frostbite claimed the lives of thousands. But the winter itself was not the decisive factor. Rather, it was the Soviet ability to exploit it that turned the tide. By the end of 1941, German forces were stalled on the outskirts of Moscow, exhausted and undersupplied. This marked the beginning of a Soviet counteroffensive, one that would be bolstered by a series of strategic masterstrokes. Chief among these was the brilliant use of deception to mislead and outmaneuver the German High Command. One of the most significant deception operations was the maskirovka, or military deception, employed by the Soviet Union. This multifaceted strategy involved everything from false radio transmissions to dummy tanks and aircraft, designed to confuse German intelligence. A prime example of this was during the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Soviets successfully concealed the buildup of their forces along the flanks of the German Sixth Army. The Germans, believing they had already achieved a decisive breakthrough, were caught completely off guard when the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Operation Uranus was a masterpiece of Soviet military strategy. The plan involved encircling the German Sixth Army by attacking their weaker, overstretched flanks, which were manned primarily by Romanian and Italian troops. The result was a devastating double envelopment that trapped over 354-plus soldiers inside Stalingrad. The Germans, who had been ordered by Hitler to hold their positions at all costs, found themselves surrounded with dwindling supplies and no realistic chance of escape. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point in World War II. It was not just the physical destruction of the German Sixth Army that mattered, but the psychological blow it dealt to the entire Nazi war effort. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Red Army demonstrated its growing proficiency in large-scale operations. While Stalingrad was the most dramatic example of Soviet strategic brilliance, it was far from the only one. The Soviets also capitalized on their vast manpower reserves, organizing partisan movements behind German lines. These partisan forces disrupted supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and gathered critical intelligence. The Germans were forced to divert considerable resources to suppress these uprisings, further weakening their ability to sustain their front lines. The Allies also played a crucial role in wrecking Hitler's invasion plans, even from thousands of miles away. The Lend-Lease program, initiated by the United States, provided the Soviet Union with vital supplies including trucks, food, and raw materials. These contributions, while sometimes overlooked, were essential to keeping the Soviet war effort alive during its darkest hours. The Allies' efforts in other theaters also tied down German resources, forcing Hitler to fight a multi-front war he could not sustain. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders such as Georgy Zhukov emerged as some of the most effective military leaders of the war. Zhukov's leadership during the defense of Moscow and his role in planning counteroffensives showcased his ability to adapt and outthink his opponents. Under his guidance, the Red Army transformed from a beleaguered force into a juggernaut capable of taking the fight to the Germans. As the tide turned against Germany, the Soviets began to employ a strategy of relentless pressure. Rather than giving the Wehrmacht time to regroup, the Red Army launched continuous offensives, forcing the Germans into a constant state of retreat. Key battles, such as Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, demonstrated the growing superiority of Soviet tactics and equipment. At Kursk, the Germans attempted one final major offensive in the east, but their plans were anticipated and thwarted by the Soviets, who had constructed extensive defensive fortifications. The defeat at Kursk marked the permanent loss of German strategic initiative in the east. By 1944, the Soviet Union had not only halted the German advance, but had begun liberating occupied territories. The Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe was swift and brutal, fueled by both a desire for revenge and the strategic necessity of ensuring German forces could never threaten Soviet territory again. The overwhelming manpower and industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, combined with their mastery of strategy and deception, had turned the tide of the war. Hitler's invasion plans were ultimately doomed not just by his own miscalculations, but by the extraordinary resilience and ingenuity of his opponents. The Soviet Union, battered and bloodied, had risen from the brink of collapse to become the dominant force in the European theater. Their ability to adapt, innovate, and exploit the weaknesses of the Wehrmacht turned Operation Barbarossa from a potential triumph into a catastrophic failure for Nazi Germany. The wrecking of Hitler's invasion plans was not the result of any single event or individual, but a combination of factors. The vastness of the Soviet landscape, the fierce resistance of its people, the brilliance of its commanders, and the strategic support of its allies. Together, these elements created a perfect storm that the Third Reich could not withstand. The lessons of Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front remain relevant to this day, offering insights into the importance of logistics, deception, and the dangers of underestimating an opponent. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was a gamble he believed he could not lose. Instead, it became the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime, proving that even the most formidable plans can be undone by a combination of determination, strategy, and sheer resilience.